Good evening, everyone. I know there's a couple of Waterford people here anyway. They've been born in Waterford, so they'll probably understand the accent. Can everyone hear me, first of all, I suppose?
Yes.
I'll try to keep the voice up. And can everyone understand me? To some extent, anyway. All right, okay. I have to correct Pat, Cormac. I'm not a maritime historian. I'm a fisherman who's interested in local history and in local stories, and that's my passion and kind of what drives me. So I'm not a trained historian. I do my best, and hopefully what I have for you tonight will be of interest. But it's a mixture of fishing and seafaring. And I have a couple of models with me as well, which hopefully will help to illustrate it. I was born and reared in Cheekpoint in a household where my mother's people were fishing people and my father's people were seafaring people. And it was kind of a little bit of oil and water. My father wanted to be away the whole time. And my mother expected him to be home at least at some stage of the day or the night. But between the two of them, I got a real, I had a real sense of what it was to be from a maritime home, and the real the distinction between that and other people's lives. It felt really special to me growing up. Her stories and my grandmother's stories and what my father had to tell as well gave me a sense of just how important that way of life was. But also growing up in Cheekpoint at that point, there was still a lot of the old ways around. And when I go gallivanting around the village, I'd be bumping into fishermen that were mending nets. I'd be bumping into lads that were working on bean trawls, would you believe, they were probably out of date at that point in time, but they were still being used in Cheekpoint. There were lads mending and repairing weir nets, working on boats. And the one thing, if you had any kind of an interest in that, they welcomed you in and they kind of coached you in the way of it. So by the time I left school, or escaped school I suppose might be the correct term, all I wanted to do was to get out on the river and go fish. And that's what I did for 15 years. And I think, you know, my daughter is here and she was born after the fishing, kind of just as the fishing was coming to a stop. But it was one of the happiest phases of my life, being out on the river with the men, participating in a way of life that was coming to an end, and it did come to an end in 2006. It was almost like a bereavement. It was almost like something died in the place. And to people from outside, I think that might be a difficult concept to understand. But if your whole way of life is suddenly taken away, as it was for salmon drift net fishermen in Cheekpoint in 2006, you don't really have, if everything that you do is based around fishing and it's suddenly removed from you, well, what have you left? The pub. They don't go work in factories, they don't go, the skills aren't transferable because you're your own boss, you have your own way of life and you're free to do whatever the heck you want. And it's a way of life that just can't be corralled and easily fitted into other ways of working and other ways of life. The other part of the fishing, the eel fishery, finished in 2007, and that was the nail in the coffin, I suppose. I'd started in 2004, recognising that our way of life was under threat, and one of the things we could do would be to try and communicate how important that way of life was through valuing the heritage element of it, and to try and record that and put on some kind of exhibitions around that. And there was energy around that, and we had some success in the first couple of years, but when the fishery closed, everyone's energy completely disappeared. And it was 2014 before finally I thought to myself, I have to do something. Like, nobody seems to be very interested, but I have to do something for myself. And what I started doing was writing a blog online, putting down the stories and putting them out there. And as I was saying to Cormac, I'm no writer, And I was hoping somebody else would come along and do it, but nobody has come along at this point in time that I'm aware of anyway. And when I first put it out there, I expected to be absolutely hammered and ridiculed from all quarters, but it didn't happen, and up to now it hasn't happened either. So I'm happy enough to continue. The first book I did was before the tide went out, which was really just a local story, and I suppose it's more for locals, but it tells about what it was like growing up in a fishing village when that was basically all that people did, and what it was like for me to start fishing and the stuff that I learned from going out to fish. And after that book was finished, I started to concentrate on some of the seafaring stuff, which was a whole different ballgame, I suppose. And that's just a picture of myself with my brother and my younger brother Chris and my father and a chap that was fishing with me, a cousin of mine, Paul Duffler, and it was probably taken in the 80s. It's only one fish, and very often that's all we got. What's that?
A pint.
Oh, a pint. All right. Thank you. But anyway, it was one of our. So as I said, after the first book, I started working on Waterford Harbour Ties and Tales, which was more about seafaring stories and what it was like to be at sea. My father is on the left, Bob Doherty, and the man on the left, on the right, to your right is Tom Sullivan. And Tom is still with us. And recently I bumped into Tom. My father would tell the most outrageous stories to the extent that you didn't know where the truth started and ended. But Tom was telling me recently a true story about the two of them. And this picture was taken on a BP tanker in the Arabian Gulf, sometime, I'd say, in the late 50s, early 60s. Tom, of course, started the story. How hot was it, Tom? So hot, he said you could fry our breakfast on the deck of the boat. So the two of them anyway decided they were going to have a bit of a run ashore. It was a dry country, Tom said, but they got a boat ashore and they went into this BP compound, which was basically a sealed off area where the crew could go in and there was drink and there was entertainment and what have you. So as the two of them were walking up, they were with a Scotsman, an engineer, and they were passing the swimming pool, and the swimming pool was bone dry, and Tom reckoned there was a bit of maintenance going on or something like that. And then they went to the compound anyway, and they started having the few drinks, and sure, one drink led to the third drink, the fifth drink, and the seventh drink. And by the time the night was over, the Scotsman, the two boys were fairly bad, but the Scotsman was completely Mogadoran, and they were told to get out. So each of them had the Scotsman under each arm, and they bring him out through the door. And strangely enough, when he hit the fresh air, it actually adjusted him up. He sort of got a burst of energy. And with that, anyway, away he goes, bursts free of the lads, runs over, dives head first into the pool. Jesus, Tom, I said, and did he survive? He said he did. He went in at the shallow end. That's the only thing he saved. So, that was Tom's a true story. I have no doubt about it, and just the way to. But my father, of course, would have to put a spin on that and to be all kinds of legs and arms under it. But that's what the second book was kind of based around. Outrageous stories, but at the end of it, there was always a nugget of truth, and those were the bits that I tried to unpick and to find the actual truth behind them. And that's what the second book was based on. It came out in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic, which was a very bad time to be even trying to do something like that. But anyway, however, it's out there and it's going well for me. People are interested in it. So, Cormac, I have to correct Cormac on another point. The Shure and the Barrow connect into each other and they flow as one. This happens quite a lot. I always say it's the Shure Estuary, and the Wexford lads call it the Barrow Estuary. And I don't think that we're never going to agree fully on it. Here's Cheekpoint here. Here's Waterford Harbour. Hookhead is on this side, which I'm sure you'll all know. Dunmore is on this side. And this is Tramore here. So if we come up the harbour then, Creighton Head, Broomhill, we come to Duncannon. You can see the channel here, up along through Duncannon, up along to Arthurstown, Ballyhack, passage on this side. Some of you will have crossed over on the ferry on it from time to time, I'm sure. Up around Buttermilk Castle is here. Here's Cheekpoint, and here's the meeting of the Three Sisters. The Barrow and the Nore are coming down this way, and this is the shore. And this little piece here is a piece called Campoil Pill. I was delighted, David was straight on to me when Cormac's book came out to tell me about the Pill place name in Dublin. We have numerous Pill place names in Waterford, which I think go back to the Norman era, but they might go earlier than that. But that's the Campoil Pill, which brings you up to Campoil in County Wexford. And we often go up and down it, even to this day, in the punt in the summertime for a bit of a trip. Anyway, we come up past Cheekpoint. This is Kilkenny on this side, Wexford on this side, and Waterford here. Munster, surrounded by Leinster. The most eastern part of Munster, obviously. Up the channel, up here, up to past Faithlake on this side. I don't know if any of you are golfers. Faithlake Golf Club's here. Across on the other side is where the new port facility at Bellevue is. And here we come then to Little Island. Again, if there's any golfers, you'll know it. This here is known as the King's Channel. And originally this was the entry into Waterford via this tortuous route, especially for sailing ships. And then a 90-degree turn to bring you up into Waterford and up to the city. So that dates from 1787, Sawyer's chart of Waterford Harbour. But it's just to give you a sense of where we're talking about and the area. And I'll come back to the map in a little while just to talk about another point on it. Now, Waterford probably, okay, the Vikings founded Waterford in circa 914. But I suppose the biggest influence on it for many hundreds of years was the Norman influence. And I don't want to go over the history of it because I think a lot of that stuff is fairly well known. I want to talk a bit more about the smaller aspects of the history, or maybe the lesser known pieces of it that I hope might be of interest to you. But this is the Normans getting ready to travel to England in 1066 for the famous Battle of Hastings. But when Henry II arrived into Waterford, and when you read the documentation, they all mention that he arrived into Waterford. It's estimated that he had a fleet of 400 ships, carrying about 4,000, including 1,000 knights with their horses, into Waterford. He wouldn't have been able to disembark that many in Waterford. The only place or the closest he could have probably got would have been Passage East, which was further down the harbour. And I just wanted to show that in terms of just the spectacle of it and the sight of it. It's something even in England that is very well interpreted and very well talked about, and yet there's very little talk about it in Ireland. And I think in years to come, the longer we are as a nation, I think, and the further we get away from our independence, I think more of this will be appreciated, and there'll be a greater interest in understanding this era and what this actually meant for the country. There's a lot of talk about Bag and Bun, quite rightly, as where the Normans landed, Raymond le Gros and what have you in 1170. But what happened at Passage between the landing of Strongbow and the landing of Henry II, I think is a story that is well worth telling. And a good friend of mine, Damien McClellan, has been working on trying to expose a little bit of that. Anyway, I'll crack on. And the reason I mentioned the Normans is that they brought a lot of maritime trade into Waterford. Many of the ships that were provided were from Bristol merchants, and Waterford and Bristol became very much, the trading links between the two were very much part and parcel of the growth of Waterford as a maritime port. But also connections because of that location with France and with Spain, and a huge amount of trade between Waterford with hides and with wool, but also with fish, which was something that John de Courcy Ireland wrote about way back when. And when I was growing up, I had two academic idols, if you like. One was John de Courcy Ireland, and the other was a guy called Arthur Went. I don't know if those names are familiar to you. But for a young lad who was interested in fishing history, and when you read history books, there's nothing about fishermen and there's very little about maritime. To find these two guys writing so accurately and so interestingly about that area was just a revelation to me. Anyway, James Rice, is any of you ever walked the Camino? Nobody. I'm staggered by that, I have to say. Because usually there's hands shoot up everywhere. The Camino is one of these pilgrimage routes in northern Spain. Many of them are overland via France, through Spain, and overland into Compostela, the city of Compostela. James Rice did the pilgrimage twice. He was the 11 times mayor of Waterford in the 15th century. And on two different occasions he went on pilgrimage to Compostela from Waterford in a sailing ship. And it seems that it was quite a common enough occurrence in that era. And a lot of archaeological evidence remains of ships coming back and pilgrims bringing scallop shells from Compostela, and they being found in various excavations in the country. This is his cadaver tomb, which can be found in Christchurch Cathedral in Waterford. So that's in the Viking Triangle in Waterford. And it's basically, it's a reminder to us that the sculpture is of a human figure, but it's been consumed by worms and by insects and by frogs. And basically it's a reminder to us all that no matter who we are and no matter what status we reach in life, we'll all end up the same way, 6 feet under, and well, unless we're burned, but 6 feet under and worm food. Now, generally speaking, people accept, oh yeah, there was a lot of trade, and there was a lot of trade between Waterford and France and Spain and Bristol and what have you. But when you talk about the fishing trade, people kind of glaze over, and because there isn't a huge amount of interest or knowledge about fishing and fishing techniques, especially at that time. Now, I brought along a model for you for, this is a picture from Arthur Went, and it's a picture of a fishing weir, or a fish trap, some people would say, and it's just off Cheekpoint. And there's a second one out through the eye of the weir there. You can see another one down the river. And I made a model of it just so that I'm hoping it'll help. I use it quite a bit in workshops that I give at home when I'm trying to educate people about the fishing and about the fishing heritage. And can you all kind of get a sense of this? Can you see? Mm-hmm. So it's made of timber poles, basically, okay? And the timber poles are driven into the river. Now, as a child, I worked on these, and there's still a couple of working models of these in the river, although there's not much reason for them to be fished at this point in time. But the first mentions of these weirs were when the monks, they were known to be used by the monks of Dunmore Abbey, which was founded around 1201. They were known that when the Knights Templars were given lands at passage, they were given fishing rights with fishing weirs as well. And there's documentary evidence of fishermen on Great Island at the meeting of the Three Sisters having access to fishing weirs. And in fact, the island at one point was known as Dubarry's Island, from a guy, John de Londa Dubarry. Sorry, I'll just double check that. John Dubarrow de Londe, who was exporting herons from Great Island, and it was known to be at least 4 of these weirs, or something similar to this kind of weir, in operation at a particular period of time. Anyway, as I said, poles driven down into the riverbed, which creates a funnel. If it's facing up the river, it's known as an ebb weir, because it works when the tide runs ebb, when the tide runs out. If it's the other way and it's facing downriver, it works when the tide comes in, so it's known as a flood weir. Okay, so you have the poles driven down into the river. These poles, supporting poles, which run along horizontally, are known as rubberies locally. They were placed up to give it strength, and then they were nailed into place. In the old days, when I was first doing it, the nails were made by blacksmiths in Waterford, and they were handmade to be driven into it. At the top of it here, this part here, is known as the head, and there's a platform here that you were supposed to work from. So this is where the net was fished from. The two poles here, going down, and basically these are cleaned off and run smooth, and on each one there will be 3 metal rings known as gads. The top one was for the head, was for the top of the weir. There was one for the middle, and there was one for the foot, or the end of the weir. These were, if the net wasn't working, they were hauled up, the rope hauled up the last one, which brought up the others, and the net came clear of the water and wouldn't fish. But when you wanted it to fish, so if this was an ebb weir, you might set it at the top of the high water, or just when it was starting to ebb, and the net would drop down and it would hold up like that. And when the tide would start to run, the wings would act like a funnel, drive the water out through it, and the weir net was secured away and tied off with an anchor rope at the end, just like that. So it worked like basically like a trawl net, but it's a fixed engine. So if you think of a trawl with otter boards and what have you, keeping it open, or even a beam trawl, it's something similar, but it's fixed in the river, and it depends on the flow of the tide. It works best on spring ebb tides if it's an ebb weir, and when the tides are lighter, like on neap tides, it wouldn't work as well. But they were fished, and they were fished commercially for a long number of years, and I can even remember fishing at the time. So they were something that was really, they're synonymous with Waterford. They have a huge history, but they are at risk of dying out. And when you think of all the heritage that we have in the country, and what people talk about in terms of preserving heritage, when you have actual working heritage, it's just a shame to see them crumble away and not to be put to any use. There was a story to go with the weirs when I was growing up. It was about one of the older lads in the village named Doherty. Christy was he was a fisherman, and his 2 brothers lived at home with him in Marion Terrace, Paddy Doherty and Johnny Doherty. And the story went anyway that Christy went down one morning, actually to haul that second weir, the one that's further down, the sheed weir, as it's known, from the sheed rock. And it was one of these winter mornings. It was dark, and he was going down for low water. Christy was worried that there had been a strong wind from the southern, and it was after calming off. And he figured that the wind was going to come from the northwest. And one of the winds that you really worry about at Cheekpoint is northwest wind, because it tends to blow low. It can come very, very quick and very strong. So Christy went down to the weir and hauled up close to the wing, took the gob rope in his hand, that's what this is called, hauled down along the gob rope to the cod end. He hauled this up, and the net came up to the bow of the punt. He'd haul the net over the bow of the punt to catch it, and then he would have to open the anchor rope here at the end to open the end of the cod end so that he could spill out the fish out into the punt. But just as he was doing it, the wind suddenly came on, and it came on so quickly that he didn't have time to adjust. The punt went from under him, actually sank under him, and of course, true to most fishermen in the area, he couldn't swim a stroke. So he was suddenly left out in the middle of the river, and the only thing he could do was grab the weir net and climb hand over hand up towards the weir. When he got to the wing, he climbed up onto the weir, up to the top, onto the head here. Some people I think they might have referred to it as a castle at times. And he hunkered down there because all he could do was wait until daylight came on and somebody might come and hopefully look for him. And as luck would have it, he had a couple of fags in the top pocket, and he managed to keep them dry. So he lit up, hunkered down, and said a prayer to himself. I'm sure that he was after managing to survive. Now, at this stage at home, Johnny and Paddy were probably rising, and they would have known his routine, they would have known the tides, and they would have known when they'd be expecting to rain. No sign of Christie. So the boys obviously were concerned, went back into the shed, on with the oilskins and the boots, and away they went down. You know, because the wind was coming from the northwest, they wouldn't have went to the village, they'd have went to the strand, because they know he would have went down there to work the shelter. When the wind was northwest and on the ebb tide, he'd go down onto the strand or onto Ryan Shore, which was the only place you know that you'd find shelter. Went down there, no sign of the boat anywhere. They knew then there was trouble. Ran back to the village, and as they were going, any house they passed it, they knew that there was fishing folk in. They knocked them up and they let them know what was going on. And soon there was a whole gang assembled on Cheekpoint Quay and all getting ready to go out. The boys went first for the sheet weir because obviously that was where they would have last been, and it was the best chance they had of finding. So as they were rowing down, it was just becoming daylight, and they could see some sort of a shape up on top of it, and it kind of raised their hopes. So as they came close anyway, they called out, "Christie, Christie, are you okay?" And a weak enough voice called out, "Oh, just in time, lads, just in time." Paddy hopped out of the boat, up the way of the weir. He honestly thought the man was on his last breath, you know. He said, "Christie, Christie, how are you?" He said, "I'm grand." He said, "This is my last cigarette."
Can you describe the boats that the type of boat that he would have been in?
He was in a punt, small timber punt, hardly built, about 20 foot long maximum. And at that time, he probably was either rowing or he might have had a small seagull engine. But 20 foot, 3 thoughts, and yeah, very basic. Very basic. Look, I'm telling that story because I think it kind of epitomises the way they were, and do you know what I mean? They were very down to earth, very matter of fact, and nothing really fazed them. Do you know what I mean? I mean, the boat was gone, but he knew they'd find it. Do you know what I mean? He was live, he knew the lads had come for him, and do you know, there was no big deal made out of it or anything else like that. And that story was told just as a bit of a, you know, it was a warning to you on one level, but it was also a coaching lesson to you as well. Do you know what I mean, in terms of how you might keep yourself safe if you needed to. Now, as I said, maritime trade and just the extent of it going out of Waterford. One of the stories I came across, this is Passage East, and now that I've managed to use this, Cormac, it's a great thing altogether. I couldn't find the button first. So this is Passage East, and I mentioned that on the chart. So as you're coming up the harbour, you pass Craighead, you pass Duncannon, and Passage East is the first point you come to. And when Henry II landed, I presume it was here below Passage, down on Passage Strand, okay, heading away down towards Woodstown. This was known as the Spanish Fort. So this fort was built apparently by Spanish prisoners of war. And you can see here there seems to be a boat getting built down on the Strand there and Passage, and the 3 quaysides here. But one of the stories I came across was a story about the St. James's Day flotilla. So the St. James's Fair was held around July 25th every year in Bristol. And we have a story from 1635 from a guy by the name of Sir William Burton, who was an English politician and writer, and he did a tour of Europe and Ireland around that time, and he published it in a book. But he arrived in Passage on the 24th of July, and he had difficulty finding accommodation because the entire place was full of people who were heading to St. James's Fair in Bristol on a fleet of ships as soon as the weather came good. Anyway, this poor fella thought he had it bad because on the St. James's Day the wind was sufficiently calmed and stood fair, and day in the 12th, he's talking about the 912, which was an English naval vessel, he was going aboard to be brought over. They discharged a piece of ordnance to some us aboard very early, so I was constrained to go aboard without my breakfast, the poor man. He further went on to complain about the trip over. He was in a very fast warship, but they had to go at the pace of the slowest ship, which was in the Convoy. So he described it as they wafted over from Waterford on the breeze. But what he went on to describe was about 50 ships travelling from Waterford in convoy. And why they were travelling in convoy was they were concerned about Barbary pirates and privateers, French privateers, coming in and breaking up the convoy and stealing produce, or actually taking people prisoners, either as slaves or for ransom. So of those 50 ships, I've been trying to work out exactly how many people would be aboard, and there isn't a description of what the ships were, so it's very hard to know exactly. But of those 50 ships, if it was, I think as a reasonable estimate would be 50 people, at least on some of them. There might have been less and more on others, but as an average of 50 people, it would be about 2,500 people leaving from Waterford to go to a fair in Bristol on one day in 1645. So it gives you a sense of just what kind of trade was going on and the connections that were there between Ireland, England, and probably wider and beyond that. It's just one of these things that fascinates me. And of course, you'll probably have heard of the sack of Baltimore, which happened only 3 or 4 years before that event. So it was a very real thing, but I mean, the level of trade must have been phenomenal. Now, I'm jumping hundreds of years here, but this is Waterford in and around 1830. That's Reginald's Tower, which I'm sure many of you, it's synonymous with Waterford, obviously. But we have 2 steaming vessels there on the quay. And the one at the back is called the Northwards, which was built in 1926, and the one in front of it is the City of Waterford, the paddle steamer. They're both paddle steamers, but they're both rigged with sails as well. The insurance policy at the time, and it would be a number of years before any of that started to fall away. Waterford at this time had seen one of its most significant developments in that a new harbour commissioners was founded in 1816. They were seeing that the corporation wasn't really facilitating trade, and they wanted to try and ensure that Waterford was ready to meet the demand that was there, but also to meet the coming of steam and more frequent vessels and more regular trips in and out of the port. So in 1816, the Harbour Board took over the running of the port, and it also took responsibility for ballast, for dredging, for piloting, and for access into the port. Primarily to look after, well, not primarily, I beg your pardon, but that was so crucial when it came to the arrival of steam and what that would mean to the city. And I'm just going to go back here. And I mentioned when coming up to Waterford, you came via this tortuous route known as the King's Channel before you got into Waterford. One of the crucial bits that Waterford Harbour Commissioners did at that time was they got a grant from the English Parliament to dredge this area here, which was known as the Ford. Some people call it the Queen's Channel, but locally all the fishermen ever only refer to it as the Ford Channel. So that was dredged, and Ford obviously is, as you'll probably be well aware, a crossing point. There had been work done on it previous to that, but it doesn't seem to have been successful. But they got a large quantity of money in order to dredge it. More work was done in the 1860s, and more work again was done as late as the 1930s in order to keep that channel open, to widen it, and to facilitate larger and larger vessels coming into the port. But it was crucial to the development of Waterford. And if any of you are sailors, you probably know that there's great shelter here and great anchorage in the King's Channel to this day. But it's the primary route into the city is via the fort, and it takes about a mile off of it, and probably in the days of sail it would have been hours you would have been talking about, depending on the tides. But in the days of steam, when there was literally dozens and dozens of ships entering and leaving it at all times of tide, trying to get up through the King's Channel would have been an absolute nightmare. It would have absolutely crucified Waterford at the time. So I'm sorry about that now going back, but just to emphasise the point. The Nora Karenna, in her first year in 1826, did 52 trips between Waterford and Bristol, there and back. So it gives you a sense, when you think about sailing ships and different journeys that those would have taken between, getting them loaded, getting them across, getting them emptied, maybe filling ballast to come back, and then of course the vagaries of wind and tide and weather. It could have taken weeks to make the trip, and suddenly they were able to do it like clockwork, which saw a revolution in terms of Waterford, in terms of its maritime trade, but it also saw a revolution in terms of providing foodstuffs to the ever-growing market in England with the Industrial Revolution. So what happened with that then was previous, you can see here, this is what's known as a lighter. And I know that phrase would probably be common enough with you here as well in Dublin. The lighters would have carried about 40 tonne of produce, and it would have taken days because they worked with the tide. So they had a crew of 3 men. They used poles into the river. They went with the tides, but they used poles to keep them on track as they went along the river. They used 2 long oars known as sweeps to try and help when they needed to move across maybe slack tide or something like that. And there also, you can see this very fine tiller. And probably the most important element of the kit aboard them was an anchor, because once they'd made those hard miles, once the tide turned on, the most important thing they could do was make sure that they didn't lose anything. Drop anchor and hold on, wait for the next tide to come, and away they go. I mean, there's very little written about the workings of them that I've found so far, but I'd estimate that it would probably take you at least 3 days to get from New Ross to Waterford via a lighter. That's my estimate, and I'm happy to be challenged on that. But the paddle steamers that were brought into play were to facilitate bringing produce from the likes of New Ross and from Dungannon into Waterford to try and meet the demand for the ships that were travelling over to England, bringing that produce over, whether it was bacon, whether it was fish, whatever it was. So this is the paddle steamer Ida. She was the last paddle steamer to run from New Ross to Waterford. She was actually 148 feet long. She was 19 feet wide, including paddles, and she had a depth of 9 foot. And this is a model of her here, just to give you a sense of the scale of just in terms of the carrying capacity of this vessel. She ran from New Ross about 8 o'clock in the morning, and she arrived into Waterford an hour and 15 minutes later, depending on the tides. So I think with the best tides, probably an hour and 15, but if she was meeting tides against her parts, it might have made it a bit slower. The paddle steamers literally transformed Waterford, and I suppose they were the brainchild of a family that became synonymous with Waterford, and probably some of you will have heard of the Malcolmsons. The Malcolmsons started out in the milling business. They were responsible for an absolutely ginormous operation in Port Law, and they could see the importance of fast delivery of raw material and also the export of what had been created. They got into shipping. They were responsible, of course, for they were the founders of the Waterford Steamship Company. They created the Neptune Iron Works in the Park Foundry in Waterford, which was built to repair their ships. And later they got into shipbuilding, and they were renowned as some of the most technologically advanced ships of their era that they were building in Waterford at that particular time. And this ship here, the Ida, was built in Waterford in the Neptune Iron Works at the Park. She was launched, I think it was 1867, 1868, and she ran up until July 1905. when the coming of the railways basically made them redundant, and later I suppose then they were replaced by trucks. I suppose the lightshores died out around the turn of the 20th century, but there were still some models of them working in Waterford in the 1950s, but they had by and large died out by 1910. So a vital component, I suppose, in Waterford's trade, and it's one of those. They did a variety of tasks. They got into Waterford at 9:15, for example, and then they made themselves available to do any number of different tasks around the port. Could have been salvage of ships out off of the hook. It could have been towing vessels out or towing vessels back up. They were involved in port maintenance. And one of the most remembered aspects of the paddle steamers were the Sunday excursion trips, where they took people from Waterford and from the Ross down the harbour to different events like regattas, you name it, horse racing on Duncannon Strand, the opening of a church, a hurling match in New Ross. They'd bring hundreds of people to the events. And if you think online, well, there's a picture of the Ida, and well, there's not a life jacket in sight anywhere, so health and safety didn't come into it. But there's literally hundreds. I've read one account which said it was 750 brought to New Ross on the Ida for a hurling match in 1898 to celebrate 100 years of commemorating 1798. Now, whether they all went on the one trip or whether she made two trips, I can't tell you, but I do know that they said there were 750 aboard the Ida, bringing hurlers from Waterford and from Glenmore into New Ross. Now, how the Waterford and the Glenmore men got on that trip, nobody ever recorded it. I certainly haven't seen it, but I say it must. I say going must have been fairly tense, and coming back it was probably even worse, especially if there was a bit of drink taken. I just want to touch on this, but one of the other factors in Waterford with the coming of the Harbour Commissioners was the creation of the Waterford Pilot Service. Based at Dunmore East, they worked out a sailing craft. Their role was really, although they were based at Dunmore, their role was really to be aboard these kind of vessels and to sail out around the hook area, waiting for ships to come in, put a pilot aboard, and then the pilot would be taken off at passage. Or if it was going to New Ross, they'd come as far as Cheekpoint, and then a New Ross pilot would take them from there up to the port in New Ross. The sailing vessels were early on. The pilots were always in trouble with the Harbour Commissioners. They were always not doing their job right, or there was always some problem. They were basically, if there was ever a problem, they were the ones that were at fault. But the sailing boats that were involved in it stayed on the route. The last of them was known as the Doherty. She was a Brixton trawler, and she finished in 1951, would you believe. She was replaced by a steamboat or a motorboat called Betty Breen. She was built by Tyrrell's and Art Club. She came into Dunmore from that point forward. But sail had stayed on the route for that period of time. And of course, the one big dispute that the pilots had was with the hobblers. And I know you'd be fairly familiar with hobblers here in Dublin. I'm certainly in Dunleary. But the hobblers had been on that route and providing that service for hundreds of years, probably before the official pilots came on. And the newspapers were full of arguments and altercations between the pilots and the hobblers. The hobblers were always rowing out in their boats, trying to get to these incoming vessels and haggling with them for a fee to bring them up into port, because they were following on from a custom that they had always done, and murdered then with the Harbour Commissioners about taking on these unofficial pilots, these hobblers, and taking away from the work of the pilots themselves. And I just mention it because I think it's worth recording that the hobblers were based in Waterford as well as in Dublin. And there's probably hundreds of years of history there, but most of it is unrecorded. They don't feature in any of the written work that I'm aware of. and there's very little mention of them even in newspaper articles, except when there's a row or there's a fight or there's a dispute, which unfortunately is often the case in newspapers. You only get the bad accounts, you know, the bad stories. But it's just, I'd like to keep it in mind. And I know we're here with the old gaffers, so obviously you'll be interested in these sailing vessels in Dunmore East. Regattas were a crucial feature of Waterford's maritime history, and they went on certainly for hundreds of years. And I just brought along a couple of I have a couple of notes on them, just in terms of the races. So they were basically staged in all the villages. So I mentioned Passage, Ballahack, Duncannon, Dunmore East. They went as far as Tranmore, Helvick, Dungarvan, up to Waterford City and up to New Ross. And the races, there were all manner of races. Some of the courses were incredibly long. I mean, there was one race at Cheekpoint, which left from Cheekpoint, went down past Duncannon to Cravenhead, turned there and came back to Cheekpoint and done 2 loops of Cheekpoint before they finished up the race. So that was probably 18, 20, 24, 26 miles of a sailing race. And there were huge crowds when the weather was good. There was huge crowds attended these events. They were massive. The paddle steamers ran. People came in their own boats to the villages for the events, and there were great social occasions. And I have here, in terms of some of the names of the races, so various classes of races were run. There was a ship's gig race, there was a pair-oared and sculling punts race, there was a pram race, which would be known as a local prom, there was a duck hunt, there was second-class fishing yawls, half-decked pleasure boats, lobster pot boats, which were oar or sail allowed. There was the Passage and Ballyhack fishing yawls, sailing punts, first-class yawls, pair-oared punts, swimming races and coast guard races. And the one that I can't tell you anything about at all was one that was called the farmers' race. So how the farmers got in on the act, I don't know, or whether it was actually farmers that did it or what was done, I don't know. But I can tell you that there was also women's races in rowing, and there was also men and women's combined teams in races. And pictures were taken, medals were given out, and they were highly sought after. And when I was growing up in Cheekpoint, there were still fellas given out about certain fellas that won a race that they shouldn't have won a race because the boat wasn't this, that, or the fifth, another thing. But there was also more serious altercations, and very often when you look at the newspapers a week or two after a regatta, you'll find the court reports are full of altercations that happened after the races as well. So, for example, in one, Joseph Halligan of Ringville, which is on the Kilkenny side of the barrow, was brought before the Petty Sessions in New Ross after he wielded a bottle at a brawl in the regatta. Halligan arrived in Ross with his neighbours and friends to race in the regatta, and some crime boys, as they called it, from the town, described the sailors and porters, had taken their oars from their boats and refused to hand them back. Tempers flared, and one of his colleagues being knocked senseless to the ground, Halligan went on the attack and broke not one but 2 bottles off of one of his tormentors. Constable Keppel, who made inquiries and found that the defendant had been much provoked on his evidence, the bench decided to fine the defendant 1 shilling with costs. His willingness to cooperate and the evidence of Constable Keppel were cited as reasons for the leniency that was shown. There was reports of faction fights between rival cot crews, so a cot is one of the smaller boats that I'm sure you've heard tell of, faction fights between them. And also the Passage regatta at one time led to a court case. 2 young lads named Connolly and O'Gorman appeared in court at the Callahan Petty Sessions on charges of having robbed the boat while attending the Passage East regatta and used it to head back upriver to Waterford. However, while en route, they were run down by the Ida, narrowly avoiding drowning. Their solicitor could do little but appeal to the mercy of the court. Judgment was withheld, but with a caution that compensation be made to the boat owner. I can only assume it was a small punt that they robbed, and not anything a bit grander, because I wouldn't say they'd have any hope of paying for it if it was anything better than a small boat. But as I said, even as a child, there were still fellas that were in disputes. There were different races that were held, and people having different advantages from them. Certainly a golden era when it came to sail, and a huge amount went on in the area. And thankfully, there's a lot of photographic evidence around, and there's a lot of newspaper reports of it as well. It's one of those areas that there seems to be a lot of information, but I don't think it's ever been written about as such at this point in Waterford, and it would really be an interesting one. Just the extent of it, how long it went back, and the various races that were involved in it. For me, anyway, I'd be fascinated with it. This is a picture of Dunmore East, and we tried to identify these boats at another occasion. And of course, we also have a lifeboat. David Carroll will tell me the name of that lifeboat, I'm sure, will you?
CNS.
Thank you. The CNS in Dunmore East. And of course, David wrote Dauntless Courage and has spoken to you before, so you'll be well aware of the heritage of the Dunmore lifeboat service and what it has meant to us. And of course, tonight's talk been on behalf of their Ireland Alive, just to mention it or go back on it. I was going to include it, and I said no, I better not, because the night would just keep going on. This is my final two slides. This is a dredger, the mud boat, as she's known in Waterford, or the Port Lariga, and she was built in Dublin in the Liffey Dockyard Company, or dockyards, and she arrived into Waterford after her engines were fitted in Glasgow in September 1907. I suppose she lasted up until the 80s, and she saw out so much of the history of Waterford Port, from the First World War, the loss of the Conning Beg and the Formby, the two Clyde ships in 1917. She worked through the 1930s and that downturn. She went through the Second World War, up to the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, until at one point she eventually broke down, and ultimately she was sold off and left Waterford, and she's now rotting away into the mud down in Salt Mills in County Wexford. Some people ask, would I not show a picture of her rotting away into the ground? I prefer to show a picture of her as she was, a working boat. She's synonymous with Waterford, and for many people it's kind of a symbol of Waterford's maritime heritage in some sense, that she was sold out from under us and left to be brought away. I did a talk on her last year for the Reginald's Tower in Waterford, and as part of it I'd done a bit of research, and I went around. I covered it in the book. It's the first time I actually wrote about the Port Lariga. But when I was doing the research, I went to some of the lads that used to work on the Port Lariga, and one of them, he told me a lovely old story of it. He said that the lads on the Port Lariga were all seamen, and they absolutely resented anyone coming aboard who hadn't their sea legs under them and didn't know the bow from the stern. And a lot of the lads that worked in the harbour commissioners, like on the shore, they mightn't have been to sea, and they mightn't have really had much of a maritime tradition, but they were genuinely interested in the boat, and they had a real feeling for her as well. But when they'd come aboard, the boys would be kind of a bit sniffy about it, you know what I mean? And they'd have to be putting them in their place. So this chap was telling me that he went aboard the first day anyway, and he was warned to keep keep your guard up and watch out for them fellas. They're all buckos, and they'll do something to you. So they went out in the morning. They did a bit of dredging out in the port, and they came back at midday, at lunchtime, 1 o'clock, tied up at Reginald's Tower, and they went off for their lunch. This was kind of custom and practice. It was a nice gentlemanly kind of work. Of course, some of them went for a liquid lunch, and then back at 2 o'clock. and away they sailed down the river to drop the spile. So this chap anyway said, everything was going great. He said, we're having a great day. And he said, then to top it off, we were just bringing her up into the King's Channel where we were going to drop the load. And one of the lads came out and he offered me a cup of tea. Jesus, I thought, this is absolutely brilliant. These fellas are really lovely fellas. I don't know what they were warning me about. So anyway, he was just putting the tea up to his mouth, and they were obviously watching him. And the hatches were opened, the spile dropped out, and she came up like a cork out of the water, just as the tea was here, and all over him. So he had been welcomed aboard the Port Oregon, he had been put in his place, and he said he had many long years aboard her, and absolutely loved the crack and the work that went with it. And as I said, although she was sold out from Waterford, she still, I suppose she's the iconic boat. She was the last working steamboat in the country. The rattle of her chains and the toot of her whistle, when I was a young lad going to Delasal in Waterford and we go down the quay, you just loved to hear it and you'd love to see her working, and she really made you feel there was a sense of importance about Port Harbour working in the river, and that connection, that historical connection that she brought. And it really was a shame to see her gone out of the place, and to see her now as well. So I suppose I finished with a more modern take. My daughter Ellen is with me tonight. She came to make sure I didn't fall asleep on the road home. This is her in the boat. It's a small punt, caravel built. She's could be 100, she could be 150 years old, I don't know. Most of the punts were maintained locally. She's at the moment turned over down on strand at Warren's Poles, bottom up, drying out with the wind. We're hoping this week to put on the anti-fouling on her bottom, a bit of the top work, turn her over again then, paint her up inside, and get her launched in the next couple of weeks before the heat comes on. She's a timber boat. The seams will open if she's in the heat too long, but if once she's out in the water, she'll be perfectly fine and she'll hold grand. They repaired them all the time, and my first boat actually had a step for sailing, just a small mast, a hole in the keel where the mast went down, and a hole in the forward taut where the mast pole went down as well. And she had a sail and stern on her as well. Now, they told me she was at least 100 years old, but you see, you don't know. The boats were repaired all the time, ribs were repaired, planks were repaired, and they did all their own work on them, and they really valued them and really looked after them. So, and as you know yourselves, timber boats, if you do mind them, and if you do take care of them, and if you do put the work into them, they will last and they will be maintained. The reason I have that up there really is that when I was growing up as a fisherman, as a young lad in a fishing community, and when I first started to fish, and then when I worked fishing myself, I got this huge knowledge of the river, of the tides, of the currents, of the weather. I got a knowledge of the place names of the river, and I got a whole social history and the maritime history told to me by the lads that were out on the river as well. And unfortunately in 2006, when the salmon fishing stopped, there was a break in the passing on of that kind of knowledge. And what I've been trying to do with the blogs is trying to, you know, almost like put a piece of cloth in the side of a boat that's sinking, just as a bit of a stopgap for a period of time, and to hope that something else might come along that will help to keep it revived. There's a lot of positive things happening in Waterford. I hear people say, oh well, Waterford doesn't have a maritime heritage centre or a maritime history museum, and certainly that is something I'd love to see at some point. But any of the museums we have are literally chock-a-block with maritime history. You might just have to go and eke it out, but it's there, and it's there for anyone to see. There's a lot of stuff happening with boat tours. For example, there's Walter Foley and Bob Dial in Ballyhack. They're running a boat out of her for the last couple of years, doing maritime tours down towards the Hook, down towards Dunmore East and back up towards Craven. And they're rebranding their trips this year as by hook or by crook boat tours, which I think is fairly nice and brings back that an unpleasant time maybe in terms of Cromwell, but that phrase by hook or by crook is certainly synonymous with the harbour. Another guy from Cheekpoint, Andy McDermott, running Osprey Viking tours out of the city. He's only starting this year. We have the Barrow Princess in New Ross doing boat tours. Brendan Lodi down at Dunmore bringing people out. I think there's a maritime walking tour to start in Waterford in the next couple of months. There's Jack Burchell, who's been doing walking tours of Waterford for a long number of years, and he's a mine of historical information which involves the maritime connection as well. But for me, I suppose really it's what I'll continue to do will be to continue to write the blogs. I've got 400 and something under my belt at this point in time. I have 208 sitting in draft on the computer that I'm still working on, and every day somebody gives me another piece of information that I think I should build on and turn into a story. So I'm going to continue to do that, but we'll also continue to bring our children out onto the river, and happily in Cheekpoint the lads locally have just put in a new pontoon, 24/7 floating pontoon access at Cheekpoint, which I think is going to be really important for a village like Cheekpoint in terms of access to the river. And hopefully it's going to bring, hopefully that's going to see more and more of that kind of facility put into the harbour, which might encourage other people out onto the water. And I think the more people use water, the more they educate themselves around water. You have to, in order to keep yourself safe. And I'm hoping that as part of that, they'll educate themselves around the rich maritime history, heritage, and in particular for me, the place names of the river. So thank you very much for your time, and hopefully
Really usual, I'm sure. I speak for everyone here when I say that was absolutely tremendous lecture. I'm sure Andrew could go on and on for another couple of hours with all of the knowledge that he has. He'll be born in the Midnight Isle in earnest. And the one thing that certainly shone through throughout the whole of his talk is the enthusiasm that he has put into the researches that he's done so far. Long may he continue to do so, to collect and highlight and preserve our maritime heritage. We might have a few questions. Anybody like to ask Andrew anything? Nigel?
There was a cross-channel ferry operated from Cheekpoint at one stage as well. What was the history of that operating from Cheekpoint rather than from the city?
Well, it was the first official mail packet station ran from Cheekpoint from 1787 to Milford Haven in Wales. It moved from there in 1814 to Passage, then to Dunmore East in 1818, and then with the coming of steam power, I suppose it made it more accessible to be able to get up to the city, and it moved to there in the 1830s. And that service it went through a number of different ownerships, but it ended up with being the Great Western Railway Company, which was based at the Adelphi Wharf in Waterford, and that would have ran up until the I'm not 100% sure now, but it certainly ran late into the 20th century from the Adelphi. It probably the most synonymous ship with her in Waterford, and one of the most popular stories I wrote is about the Great Western, which was on that route during the war years and up until the 50s and 60s. And my mother actually emigrated to London on the Great Western in 1959. So a huge history connected to that. But any of these things would take like an hour, 45 minutes to communicate around. So I didn't want to get into it too much, but that's just a synopsis, I suppose.
How much trade is coming up into Waterford now? After Bell's closed, Bell lines, there must have been a big decline, I take it, but perhaps not. I just wonder what's happening.
Yeah, it's because it's out of the city now and down at Bellevue, it's probably a little less visible to people really. But there's a lot of trade going in and out, especially in the last number of years with Brexit. And we're also getting in a lot of bulk carriers. 25,000 ton ships coming up. So there's a difference in the trade, but I actually don't know for certain in terms of the statistics of it what the levels of trade are. But it seems to me to be quite a busy enough port. For example, New Ross is much further up, but there's been 4 ships into New Ross in the last 4 weeks. So there seems to be quite a high level of trade going in and out, but I wouldn't know the statistics of it or the volumes of it. But I can tell you that a lot of those box boats are coming in, you know, those barge boat type things coming in 3,000 ton or whatever would be the max on them. But there's a lot of bulk carriers coming in. Yeah.
This gentleman here.
Andrew,
Very passionate.
that was great. The Waterman, that was great. And I particularly enjoyed seeing the image of the Ida, the paddle steamer. And it was brought back to me as things that I've done a little bit of research on. One of the regular jobs of the Ida was once a year to bring the Waterford militia down to Duncannon for their annual training, which was 2 weeks. And at the end of it, the Ida would go down to collect them. Now the last thing that happened on their annual camp apparently, they were paraded and they were given their money for the 2 weeks. And they would come back up on the Ida, which would berth at one of the pontoons near
Yeah, the Reginald's Tower.
Reginald's Tower. The guys would want to get off quick and head for the pub. They would be met by their families who wanted to intercept them to get some of the money, get at least some of the money. And where there are newspaper reports of, shall we say, family disputes on the gangway, and as they came off, as some of the wives tried to intercept them and get some of the money, and the RIC might be called in to break up the ensuing.
Yeah.
But in terms of the maritime heritage, there is an Irish equivalent of the Mary Rose, the famous warship that sunk in the Solent. 1645, during all the wars, the Great Lewis, a parliamentary ship, was trying to provide supplies to Duncannon, which was still held by the British. It was fired upon by the Irish, went on fire, drifted across, sank on the sands of Woodstown. It's still there. Discovered some years ago, and nothing has been done about retrieving either. It's quite possibly largely intact, but nothing has been done about it.
Well, I've never heard of any work being done on it. I'm aware of the fact that it was rediscovered all right, and that there's quite a substantial amount of it there.
Yeah.
And I'm very familiar with what goes on in the world of underwater archaeology. I haven't heard of any movement whatsoever to do any work on that particular ship.
Or even the survey to find out how much of it is there.
I'm sure the resources are very limited in that
Yeah.
particular direction. I'm sure in the fullness of time it may happen.
I think there's talks with some of the cannons, Pat, weren't they, that they'd like to bring up some, maybe 2 or 3 of the cannon to just exhibit what could be there. But yeah, there's a whole story to go with that as well, of course. And it's also said that the pub owners and the hoteliers at Duncannon bribed the army men, or the officials of the army, to make sure they didn't pay them before they got on the ship. And to bring the trouble to Waterford, because it wasn't just the RIC had to be called out. Apparently it was army units as well from the infantry, barracks in Waterford, to try and calm down the battles that used to go on the quay, and they used to literally batten them across the bridge over to the train station to get them aboard the train so that they get them away home.
Perhaps you might have another question or two. Eddie?
Have you come across the Bristol trade books showing the trade to Waterford in 1580 to 1620. something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Incredible amount of information in it, isn't there? Thanks, Edward. Andy Kelly from Waterford, who I think you'll probably know, he worked with Bill Irish on shipbuilding in Waterford, and he has a great stock of photographs, and he's a go-to for anyone in Waterford who wants photographs of particular ships and what have you. But Andy has a copy of the book and he loaned it to me for a period of time, and there's a heck of a lot of research went into it, in fairness.
My connection with, I'm Johnny Wigan, my connection with Cheekpoint is that as a youngster, for better or worse, I went fishing from Cheekpoint in a boat called the Dolphin.
Mm-hmm.
You probably remember it. It was, I don't know, about a 36-footer
Yeah.
with a little wheelhouse at the back.
Yeah.
And the guy, it was an English guy who used to live on a derelict boat in the harbour.
Ronnie Preston.
Yeah. And I went with him for some of the summer. He wasn't a great fisherman.
No.
I went on later on to work with Leo and Brian Crummy.
Okay. Yes.
Brian died there a little while ago in Dunmore. But that's what I did one summer.
Ronnie was Royal Navy apparently. Great fun then. So apparently a very good navigator and a great seaman, but he didn't know much about fishing.
He certainly didn't know much about fishing.
And he didn't.
I have to apologise to John Wigan for not recognising him at the last lecture. My apologies, because I spent a very, very enjoyable evening in his house looking over all of the maritime stuff that he collected. John's a descendant of the Wigans who used to make lighthouse equipment in Ireland, and a wonderful collection of maritime artefacts and history. So thank you very much indeed.
The other side of that family is the Jacob family, who are Waterford based. My grandfather and great grandfather were Lloyd's agents in Waterford, so that's where a lot of the shipping stuff came from.
He recorded a lot of the shipwrecks in
Oh yeah,
Tranmore.
yeah. I have the original map of those. I'm wondering who to give it to.
Amazing.
Any more? Anyone else?
With Edward's help, I've been trying to record, and with David's help as well, I've been trying to record the shipwrecks around Waterford. So I'm up to over 1,000 at this point in time, but that's just ships that were sunk in and around Waterford.
Yeah.
But Waterford ships that were sunk elsewhere, and ships that were coming to or from Waterford that sank elsewhere. It's a huge list, and it's an incredible list when you look at it in terms of the volumes of trade that were there.
Another kindred spirit in that regard here was tonight Dr. Eddie Burke, who's written extensively about various shipwrecks in several volumes. Just first of all to thank Andrew for coming all the way up from Waterford to give us a talk tonight. Thank you, Andrew, for that. I found a great many things that resonated with Dublin Port and the things that Andrew was telling us about, things like the hobblers. There was extensive hobbling all around the coast in Waterford also, and the two rowing clubs that we have here, practically Cheekpoint with us, grew out of hobbling with their double-ended, long, narrow clinker-built boats. Hobbling actually continued on in Dublin literally into the 1940s, and competitive rowing skiffs grew out of that wonderful sport. A lot of other things that I found familiar, which kind of leads me to think how similar Dublin and Waterford are, and a great many other ports, and reminds us of what a maritime country we really are. Things like fish traps, not too far from here, during excavations on a new building up on the North Quay, there were two fish traps found similar to the ones Andrew showed us, that I reckon to be between 3,000 and 5,000 years old, quite big ones, and there was quite a lot of them in other parts of the country, notably in the Shannon. There's a lot of work has been done on them down there. You also mentioned lighterage. There was extensive lighterage done here in the port before the port was developed to such a stage that it became navigable at all stages of the time for larger ships. And I found a great archive in the National Gallery of illustrations of them that had never been really recognised for what they were. They were a very unique kind of lighter. They were powered by oar and sail, built 12 oars and a large square sail like a Viking ship, but they didn't resemble Viking ships. They were literally just like a big barge, and they were used for bringing cargoes from the lower reaches of the port up to the upper reaches. But there's no photographic evidence of them, because the time photography came into being, they had outlived their usefulness. And as I say, there are plenty of drawings of them in the Brockus collection in the National Library, well worth looking at. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.